So our second part of learning about Photoshop is going to start with understanding some of the, again, less exciting concepts that you have to learn as you begin to delve into this program. And it's going to start with the concepts of bit depth and color mode. And we're going to approach those in the opposite order there. But on the right, what we have is the screen that pops up whenever you're starting a new document in Photoshop. And as you look at it, you may go, boy, there's several things that I understand and there's things that I don't understand. What do all these things mean? How do they work? And how can I then incorporate them into what I know about Photoshop? So let's jump ahead here and let's look at some of the things that we need to know. So when we start a project, we're going to see a screen just like this, and it's going to give us a lot of different choices. It's going to give us a chance to name our project. It's going to give us a chance to choose the size of the document, but also the color mode and the bit depth. And we're going to talk a little bit about what those things do. So let's jump ahead a little bit. We're going to start with the document type. So I'm going to move over to Photoshop here real quick. So when I'm in Photoshop, I start a new project. It's going to give me this screen. And again, I get the chance to name it. And I would always recommend naming it something that describes what you're working on. And then you can actually choose what you want your project to be. So if I want it to be, if I'm making a title for a video project, I can actually select that. And it's going to let me measure in pixels, which is what we work in video. Or if we work in paper, then it's going to be measured in inches. And so being able to change that, designate an actual size, that's all very helpful, and it's going to help your project be the right format and size for whatever your intended audience is. So then we also are able to choose color mode and bit depth. So let's talk a little bit about that. So color mode, if we look here, says here RGB color. Well, there are a few different color modes. We're not going to get too far into a lot of them, but it basically is how the colors are represented in Photoshop, how many channels there are. So if you look all the way on the far right, that's a bitmap color mode. There's only really two values, black and white. And then on number 4, we have grayscale, all the way over to an RGB color mode there on the far left, that color mode number 1. And so if we have an image, Photoshop is given choices for how it actually displays the color. You'll be able to see that as I click this down. I have bitmap, I have grayscale, I have RGB, I have CMYK, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then I have lab color. Lab color is able to display a large, wide array of colors, but that may not be workable on certain monitors and on certain printing apparatuses. So most of what we do is going to be in these two color modes right here. RGB color mode is what's called an additive color model. It is fairly wide, and we use it with photos and video. Every video we shoot and every photo we take is made up of red, green, and blue. And when I say additive color model, it means that I can look at these different colors, red, green, and blue, and when I add them together, they make white. And you can see that they combine in different ways to make different colors. And when you do that, it then brings out white. So you can see the different levels and different shadings of these circles really does make a white color. Now with CMYK, the color mode is called subtractive. It means that I'm mixing magenta, yellow, cyan, which is blue, and the K stands for black. It's less able to represent big colors. It represents fewer colors than the RGB model, and we use that a lot in printing. You will see that I have these colors. Again, they are all combining together to make new and different colors, but when they're all three meeting in the middle, that's when you get that black. You get that absence of all color, and so that's called a subtractive color model. So why does this matter? Well, if you look at this giant, looks like the heel of a shoe basically, all of the colors that we can see in the natural world are represented by the outside of that shape. And so we can see all those rich blues, we can see all those deep reds, we can see all those greens. If you look at the triangle that's inside of that, that's the number of colors that can be represented in the RGB color space. And that means that when we're designing certain things, we have to be cognizant of the fact that it may not be able to be recreated on a monitor or on the printed page. If you look below that, CMYK is actually even smaller of a color space. And so that's going to make a difference in terms of how we actually are able to use color. So let's take a look at an example of how this can affect an image. I have an image here, a fairly strange image, but this is an image. It's got bright greens, it's got blues and reds. It's very, very vibrant, very saturated. And if you look right up here, you can see that it is in the RGB color space. Well, Photoshop actually lets me test and see what it would look like if I was in CMYK, if I was going to print it. And what you'll be able to see is how the colors are affected when we move color spaces. Because remember, these greens are not these super bright greens are not always included in the CMYK space. So I'm going to switch to proof colors. And as you see now, all of a sudden, those greens are far less vibrant, and so are the blues and so are the reds. So I'm going to toggle these back and forth, and you can just watch and see how they change as I go from CMYK to RGB and back. And because of that, it helps us realize that CMYK is great for printing, but most often we need to be working in RGB because we want our images to look as vibrant and as colorful and as good as they possibly can. So the last part of what we're going to talk about is bit depth. And as we look at that, that's a number that basically represents how much information is getting stored in this image. We talked about it a little bit when we learned about audio in Audition, but let's look at what that means in Photoshop. When I use that drop-down menu, I'm given the choice of 8, 16, or 32-bit. That's the information that's contained in every single pixel in the image. So the higher that number gets, the more accurate it can recreate real colors. And so if I'm working in 8-bit, if you look, that's okay compared to 1-bit, but less okay compared to what is 24-bit on this image. It is a less accurate recreation of the color. So as you increase your bit depth, you increase your file size. And so it's something you have to think about as you go and realize that quality is great, but only if you can accommodate the size. But I would recommend you work in at least 16-bit. Why is that something that I recommend? Because if you look at a couple of these graphs, you'll see that this represents how much color information can be packed into each channel for 16 compared to 8. And so you can see 16 is able to do so much more. And when you have these gradients where you see black on one end and white on the other, and you have to have all these different shades of gray in the middle, you'll notice that you start to lose some of that preciseness of the grays. You get this effect called banding because there's just so many different colors that 8-bit images cannot recreate. So work in 16-bit, you see you get this nice smooth gradient. So if I jump over to Photoshop, and I see this new image screen again, no matter what I'm working on, the important thing is right here to go ahead and jump it up to 16-bit. 32-bit is fine, but it may be more than you need, and 16-bit is going to give you so much more color options than you would have otherwise. And so again, understanding what the color modes mean, understanding what bit depth does for you in your image will help your images in Photoshop look as good as they possibly can.